Good afternoon or good evening, depending on where you might be. My name is Kevin Michael Grace, and this is the KMG show for Wednesday, March the 2nd, 2022. The title for today's show is Fake, 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 Fake. How many fake stories are we going to get out of the Russian invasion of the Ukraine and all that surrounds it before these people will start apologizing or perhaps stop disseminating lies? Here's a tweet 3 hours ago from Joyce Karam, who is a senior correspondent for the national news and an adjunct professor at George Washington University. It's accompanied with a 39-second video, and it reads, Yelena Osipova, 76 years old, survived World War II and siege of Leningrad, is taken by 8 Russian police officers in St. Petersburg today for protesting war in Ukraine. Well, given that the siege of Leningrad ended in January 1944, 78 years ago, then it appears that Yelena Osipova did not survive the siege of Leningrad, or is certainly not 76 years old. No, but it just keeps coming. It never stops. Oh, yesterday, people were agog about the Russian destruction of the memorial to those killed, the tens of thousands of murdered by the Nazis at Babiyar. And guess what? Turns out that this memorial was not destroyed by the Russians or by anyone else. Someone called Martin tweeted nearly 300,000 likes on Zelensky's tweet saying that the Babiyar Memorial was hit by Russian airstrike, 300 likes on the correction today saying that it wasn't. And in more fake news, this is from Rahim Kassam at the National Pulse. The crying journalist demanding Boris drags Britain to war is a Biden-linked World Economic Forum global leader. Oh, so the World Economic Forum, one of their mottos is that in the near future, you will own nothing. Well, perhaps the reason that we will all own nothing is because we will all be dead. On Tuesday morning, so-called journalist Daria Kaleniuk confronted British Prime Minister Boris Johnson, demanding NATO enters the war in Ukraine despite massive public objections to Western nations becoming involved. Kaleniuk, however, is scarcely the journalist Western media outlets are portraying. Instead, the National Pulse can reveal Kaleniuk is a longtime political activist recently used in the Joe Biden 2020 campaign. Additionally, Kaleniuk serves as a World Economic Forum global young leader. The WEF is led by German economist Klaus Schwab and has become infamous for globalist intervention around the world, including but not limited to the Great Reset, with its idea of abolishing property ownership at its core. You're coming to Poland, you're not coming to Kiev, Prime Minister, you're not coming to Lviv, said Kaleniuk in remarks being lauded by the international press, because you are afraid, because NATO is not willing to defend, because NATO is afraid of World War III, but it has already started. There are Ukrainian children who are there taking the hit. You were talking about sanctions, more sanctions, but Roman Abramovich is not sanctioned. He's in London. His children are not in the bombardments. His children are there in London. Putin's children are in the Netherlands, in Germany, in mansions. Where are all these mansions seized? I don't see that. Well, crying, she said, my family members, my team members are saying we are crying. We don't know where to run. This is what is happening, Prime Minister. Kaleniuk featured as a Joe Biden supporter in an ABC News interview from 2019, after which she was used in a Joe Biden campaign video posted January 21st, 2020. She was also listed on the WEF website in 2019 in their Global Young Leaders program, which has also featured warmongering globalists such as Justin Trudeau, Dan Crenshaw, Emmanuel Macron, and more. The news follows a number of exposés into false reports being spread by Western media since the onset of the invasion of Ukraine by the Russian government. Yes, brave Zelensky out there on the front lines, inspecting his troops, wearing a camouflage battle gear, except that never happened. That footage was taken a year ago. Oh, and the Ukrainian beauty queen who was rushing off to join the Ukrainian military. Yeah, that was fake too. It's all fake. Everything about it is fake. Let's go to a roundup of stories from antiwar.com. State of the Union address. Biden boasts Russian economy is reeling. U.S. sending Stinger anti-aircraft missiles directly to Ukraine. Russia, according to Russia, ceasefire talks to start Thursday. UN votes to condemn invasion of Ukraine. EU plans to send fighter jets to Ukraine fall apart. Largest shipping lines suspend service to Russia over sanction. Oh, and as Iran deal, progressive parties threaten to walk away because Russia is far, far worse country than Iran, or far more dangerous, and China as well. It's a story from John McAvoy at Anti-War. Actually, this is from Fairness and Accuracy in Reporting. Western media fall in lockstep for neo-Nazi publicity stunt in Ukraine. Excuse me. Profile. Who are Ukraine's far-right Azov regiment? This is from Al Jazeera. As the Russian invasion of Ukraine enters its sixth day, this story is from yesterday, Ukrainian far-right military regiment is back in the headlines. Russian President Vladimir Putin referenced the presence of such units within the Ukrainian military as one of the reasons for launching his so-called special military operation to demilitarize and denazify Ukraine. On Monday, Ukraine's National Guard tweeted a video showing Azov fighters coating their bullets in pig fat to be used allegedly against Muslim Chechens, allies of Russia deployed in their country. Azov has also been involved in training civilians through military exercises in the run-up to Russia's invasion. And yes, Virginia, there are neo-Nazis in the Ukraine, and they are part of one of the weirdest coalitions in history. The Ukrainian government is a coalition of Jewish oligarchs and actual neo-Nazis, not fake ones. Let's go to the Russians with Attitude Twitter feed. It's one of the few places on the net which is attempting to provide actual news about what is going on. And, oh, yes, U.S. expat from Ukraine says there are robberies, rapes, and gang violence and calls Zelensky an insane regime. Clint Ehrlich comments his video about criminals running wild in Kiev went viral. Now he's telling the rest of his story about anarchy in the capital of Ukraine after the government handed out guns. Russian soldiers near Mariupol showing off their trophies, Marine and right sector flags. Ukrainian Marines have the same motto as the U.S. ones, Semper Fidelis, or always faithful. The motto of Russian Marines is, where we are, there is a victory. And there are stories coming out of Ukraine that Azov forces are not allowing people to leave cities which are under a siege. Earlier had been reported that Arsen Avakov, the former Minister of the Interior and creator of the new paramilitary forces that became Azov, Aidar, Donbass, and other similar volunteer units, had arrived in the city to raise morale and organize its defense. And a major city, the first major city, Kherson, has been overrun by Russian forces. And, oh, yes, looting going on in Kiev. Zelensky said that this would not be tolerated, but to what extent Ukraine actually has a government now is an intriguing story. Pro-Russian mayor who was accused of wanting to surrender his city to the Russians is murdered. Ukrainian politicians openly celebrate his murder, say he was killed by patriots, wink, wink. Oh, yes, Ukrainian armed forces continue to excel at martial virtues and chivalry. Ukraine's Special Operations Command just issued a warning to Russian soldiers that they will not be taken prisoner and will be slaughtered like pigs without the option of surrendering. This is public admission of a war crime. Another site at ASB Military, again, is one of the few which is attempting to provide actual news. This is a civilian area, according to the person filming. This would be at Zitomir. There is nothing to translate, really. It's just insults along the lines of, and I'm not going to repeat the nasty words here. There is very much a disconnection between the, oh, we love children line taken officially by the Ukrainians and parroted by their friends in the West, and what's happening down on the ground. There's a story from Breitbart by Nick Gilbertson. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky told the DC outlet Axios in a statement Monday that his country needs the West to impose a no-fly zone, a significant escalation, potentially tantamount to an act of war. And how did that work out in Libya, by the way, the no-fly zone? Well, it ended up with Libya being destroyed, and it ended up with Libya being carved into 3 distinct regions, and it ended up with a return to open-air slave markets in Libya, and also an invasion of Europe by so-called migrants. Zelensky, and where is Zelensky? No one knows. He's supposedly in Kiev, or Kyiv, as we're supposed to call it now, but we don't know. He could be in Western Ukraine. He could be in a U.S. military base, for all we know. Zelensky said the sanctions are heading in the right direction. In addition to disconnecting the Russian central bank from SWIFT and providing more Stingers and anti-tank weapons, we need the West to impose a no-fly zone over significant parts of Ukraine. Ukraine can beat the aggressor. We're proving this to the world, but our allies must also do their part. Allies? What allies would those be? Ukraine is not, at press time, a member of NATO. On Monday, White House Press Secretary not Jennifer, but Jen Psaki, told MSNBC that it is, quote, not something the president wants to do, not a good idea, unquote. So at least Jen Psaki isn't cheerleading for World War III and a nuclear exchange. Let's take a look at the chat. Hello to Anrun, to Dan, William Hicks, Chokin 666, Buddy. Anrun says lying is what they do for a living. Hello to GC Stahl, who says hello, Kevin, the patch, and chat. I hope everyone is okay. Hannity, a straight hack, says Buddy. Hello to Emmett Kelly's Earth. Oscar Toe, who claims to be an Antietam survivor. Hello to Zen Master of Football Analysis. Buddy says the propaganda is thick at Fox. Enron says the fact that we have to discuss this shows the MSM still has great power, even though many know they lie. William Hicks claims to have survived the German bombing of Pearl Harbor, which of course is an Animal House reference. Chokin 666 reminds us that the first casualty of war is a truth. Hello to Dr. Dead Name. And Zen Master Football Analysis, they never mentioned the biggest event, dropping nukes on Japan, selective memory. Dr. Dead Name points out, look how fast people have been switched from one official cause to another. Kind words, Dan. Thank you, but this is temporary. I don't know how temporary it's going to be. It's just, I went out last night to buy some food, and my depth perception completely gone. I was in Save On Foods, and I kept bumping into the people to my right because I could not see them, which was an unpleasant experience. William Hicks says, got to say, Kevin, the patch works well with the current events. Buddy says, COVID skeptics swallowing whole, a Putin bad madman, a trope. Hello to Metal Mike. Biden said he would cure cancer. Well, Nixon started the so-called war on cancer, a particularly inappropriate metaphor, back in 1971 at the urging of Ann Landers, the advice columnist. Yes, this is a true story. And despite trillions of dollars being spent, no, cancer is still around. But he says Waters comparing Zelensky to Churchill. David Wright says, I'm getting a more Moisha Diane vibe here. Hello to Urban Planner, who says, Azov glows, and I believe they had connections to Atom Whatever and RAM. It was a honeypot for extremists. Justin Proto, hello, says, has anyone also observed that libs hold that they'll beat the Ruskies good and hard, but are also triggered by a mere glance or utterance? Hello to the German Pointer, a new name. Do you think Trudeau will outlaw Canadian geese from going honk, honk? Good one. Jeffrey Pye, hello, says Quebec dropping rules like crazy. But no, British Columbia, my province, is still keeping the panic alive. And it's been a while since I have checked. Hello to Seraphim Goose. It's been a while since I have checked how many people have supposedly died or deaths attributed to COVID-19 in my own province of British Columbia. But of course, British Columbia is a very large place. And I live on Vancouver Island, which is has a population of approximately 800,000 people. And the BC government actually breaks down deaths in different health regions across the province. Vancouver Island is a health region all of its own. So let's see this. Come on, hurry up. Hurry up. Well, I'll go back to the chat while I'm waiting for the COVID dashboard to load. What happened to the U.S. trucker convoy, asked Oscar Toe. They're in the Midwest now, I believe. That's the last I saw from a few hours ago. And, okay, Vancouver Island. Let's see. No, I want the whole island. Come on. And just a second here. I want the whole of the island. Oh, they've broken it down into 2 regions? No, that's no good. Sorry about that. There's, 5.1 million people in British Columbia. Total deaths to date, that is deaths attributed to COVID-19. In a province of 5.1 million people is 2,883, and that is in over 2 years. This crisis was never a crisis. We were all sold a bill of goods. But I suppose we're used to that by now, are we not? Revolver.news has a story. What the hell is going on? Globalist cabal is now cheerleading for nuclear war. Thanks to the globalist American empire's ineffective, inflexible diplomacy, an avoidable, solvable crisis in Ukraine has spiraled into a major land war. Now the shrillest gay voices want to inflict an apocalyptic calamity on the whole world, mindlessly, thoughtlessly, inexcusably. They're shoving the West to the brink of a full-blown nuclear war over Ukraine. Back in January, Revolver warned that the implacable no negotiations attitude of the U.S. and its allies was creating conditions for war in Ukraine. Such a war could be an existential danger to the planet. Since then, events have only proven our analysis correct. Drunk on the same sense of self-righteousness that encouraged war in the first place, gay public figures are advocating tough policies that will invite further escalation and potentially turn a regional war into the worst disaster in human history. America's ruling elite is so used to kicking its own impotent population around with no fear of any kind of repercussion that they think they can do the same with a nuclear power. The ruling class is wrong, and its arrogance is courting existential calamity. Russia has amassed more than 6,000 nuclear warheads, which is more than even the United States possesses. Nearly 1,500 of these weapons are deployed, ready for use. Russia possesses a full nuclear triad of nuclear-armed bombers, submarines, and land-based intercontinental ballistic missiles. Russia cannot be immobilized with a single first strike. If it feels cornered, it has the firing power to bring down all of civilization. Such a reality requires leaders who will treat the situation with caution and seriousness. Right now, the only acceptable and responsible approach is one that prioritizes de-escalation and takes the conflict closer to a negotiated peace. But instead, our flippant leaders are babbling about whatever makes them feel toughest, creating an environment of constantly escalating peril. Arrogant, loudmouth oligarchs on Twitter are not helping the situation. Americans normally imagine hedge fund managers to be experts at risk, but billionaire Bill Ackman is proving otherwise by being perhaps the most insane figure of all. In a Twitter thread Monday morning, Ackman openly called for U.S. ground troops to intervene directly in Ukraine to fight Russia. He tweeted, and this was addressed to President Biden, "Is there a point at which we say it is un-American to sit back and watch this transpire? We are fighting an economic war with Russia. We're supplying weapons and intelligence with our allies, and the Ukrainians are putting up an incredible fight. The Russian army has shown itself to be weak and lacking morale. Their air force can't achieve air superiority. Putin is rallying the nuclear saber as he gets more desperate. What if? Do we wait for him to kill millions before we intervene? What precedent are we continuing to set by allowing this to play out?" No, this man is in no way deranged. Well, un-American, apparently, not to get involved in Ukraine and, kill the bear or cut off the head of the bear. Well, a famous American diplomat spoke out on this 2 centuries ago. His name was John Quincy Adams. He became a president of the United States. And he said, "Wherever the standard of freedom and independence has been or shall be unfurled, there will be her heart, her benedictions, and her prayers be. But she does not go abroad," that is, America does not go abroad, "in search of monsters to destroy. She is the well-wisher to the freedom and independence of all. She is the champion and vindicator only of her own." But I suppose the blue ticks would defame John Quincy Adams as, a coward, an isolationist, a xenophobe, quite possibly. Paul Joseph Watson has a fairly long video. There's a 13 minutes, lots of music and images, lots of fun, called Modernity 7 Nuclear Fallout Edition. It's World War Woke, and the West might be in trouble. World War Woke is a pretty good description of what's going on. I would suggest as an alternative, World War Kitsch, because that's what we are getting. That, it's all about the children. Well, what about those children in the Donbass who the Ukrainians have been shelling for years indiscriminately and killing them? But they're not children because they speak the wrong language and they live in the wrong part of the Ukraine. So a meme went viral yesterday, and it's 3 pictures, 3 horizontal pictures with your non-player character NPC, and there's a bunch of them, and there is stamped on the side of the head Biden-Harris, and there is the black power symbol on the forehead. And then we get the same little platoon of NPCs, and they are all wearing masks. They all have a code on their head, and they're all being jabbed. And the third one in the series is, well, the codes are still there, but now the Ukrainian flag is on the forehead. Someone called Jimmy's Room 1 said, "A Tim Pool fan just put this in my replies, and I'm effing dying, LOL. Many people do thing equals bad." I was kind of taken aback by this because it's typical of sheep to deny hotly their nature. But this fellow proudly embraces his sheep-like nature. So I suppose he deserves kudos, if only for honesty. Vox Day writes, the more you look into the details of the history of the current Russo-Ukrainian conflict, the more it becomes clear that A, this conflict has very little to do with the Ukrainian people per se, B, NATO, the US government, and the Judeo-Christians who influence the latter are the parties responsible for the bloodshed, and C, Russia's military intervention is not only justified and necessary, but long overdue. And he quotes from the Irish savant, who writes, well, if you're like me, you've been taken aback by the scale and comprehensiveness of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. It's the boy who cried wolf all over again, I suppose. However, a deeper analysis makes Putin's move more understandable. I hadn't been aware that Ukraine has become a de facto, if not de jure, NATO member, an absolute red line for Russia, as Putin has made clear on numerous occasions. As he has pointed out, the Ukrainian military control system has already been integrated into NATO and a network of airfields upgraded with US help, which enables the rapid transportation of very large numbers of troops. Ukraine's airspace is open to flights by US strategic and reconnaissance aircraft and drones that conduct surveillance over Russian territory. He added that the US-built Maritime Operations Center in Ochakov makes it possible to support activity by NATO warships, including the use of precision weapons against the Russian Black Sea Fleet and its supporting infrastructure. Since the 2014 coup that toppled Ukraine's elected government and installed a new regime, Russia has fully supported the Minsk Agreement, which provides the two eastern republics with political autonomy. But the Ukrainian regime, being egged on, has been subjecting the Donbass region to endless blockades, rocket attacks, and shelling. As recorded by the OECD, on the day before Russia invaded, Kiev fired over 1,500 shells on villages in Donetsk and Lugansk. The penny kopeck has finally dropped. Yes, indeed. But I suppose, the Ukrainians or the Ukrainian government, they could use the same line about the shelling that NATO and the United States has used repeatedly, that, we bomb them because we love them. And the Daily Mail, as I mentioned yesterday, the Daily Mail, it's gone absolutely insane since the invasion. But there have been a couple of voices of reason there. One being Peter Hitchens. And there is a piece in the Mail today by Bill Raggio, who is described as a senior fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies and editor of FDD's Long War Journal. From 1991 to 1997, Raggio served as a signalman and infantryman in the U.S. Army and New Jersey National Guard. He begins, wishful thinking has the upper hand in the battle to shape Western perceptions of the war in Ukraine. Sympathy for the outnumbered and outgunned defenders of Kiev has led to the exaggeration of Russian setbacks, misunderstanding of Russian strategy, and even baseless claims from amateur psychoanalysts that Putin has lost his mind. A more sober analysis shows that Russia may have sought out a knockout blow, but always had well-laid plans for follow-on assaults if its initial moves proved insufficient. The world has underestimated Putin before, and those mistakes have led in part to this tragedy in Ukraine. We must be clear-eyed now that the war is underway. Yet even the professionals at the Pentagon are letting sympathy cloud their judgment. Just 2 days into Russia's invasion of Ukraine, U.S. Department of Defense briefers were quick to claim that failing to take Kiev in the opening days of the war amounted to a serious setback. DoD briefers implied that Russia's offensive was well behind schedule or had even failed because the capital had not fallen. But U.S. leaders should have learned to restrain their hopes after their catastrophic withdrawal from Afghanistan. Once again, U.S. and Western officials are falling into the trap of failing to understand the enemy and his objectives. Raggio continues, allegedly, Putin believed that the Ukrainian government would collapse once Russian troops crossed the frontier and pushed to Kiev, and that the operation has failed because the Ukrainian government remains in place. Putin certainly hoped for a swift victory, but he clearly was not relying on his opening salvo as the only plan for success. Rather, the Russian military was prepared to take the country by force if a swift decapitation strike fell short. This kind of plan should be familiar to Americans who remember the 2003 invasion of Iraq. In the first hours of the war, the U.S. Air Force launched its shock and awe campaign in an attempt to kill Saddam Hussein and other key leaders and bring down the government. Saddam survived, but the U.S. military was fully prepared to follow up with a ground assault. A look at the Russian military offensive demonstrates that there was a plan for a full-scale invasion, which Russia is now executing. Conventional mechanized warfare is a time and resource-consuming enterprise, and an operation of this scope isn't cobbled together in days. The Russian offensive is taking place on 4 separate fronts. On a 5th front in eastern Ukraine, which Putin declared independent last week, Russian forces are tying down Ukrainian troops that are needed elsewhere. The bulk of the Russian forces are advancing southward from Belarus to Kiev. Russian advance forces, including air, mobile, and reconnaissance troops, have been engaging with Ukrainian troops outside Kiev since the start of the war. A massive column of Russian troops, estimated at over 40 miles long, is just 20 miles north of Kiev and is likely assembling to surround the capital. If Russian forces can take Kiev and push southward to link up with forces on the Crimean front, thus splitting Ukraine in two, it would be a major blow to the Zelensky government. What matters more than a handful of setbacks is that Russian forces have pushed 70 miles into contested terrain in less than a week and are on the outskirts of the capital. This is not a sign of a disorganized, poorly assembled, and failed offensive. And he concludes, Russian troops are putting up a valiant fight, facing long odds and difficult conditions. Russia holds most, if not all, of the advantages. It can and has attacked Ukraine from 3 different directions. The Russian military holds a decided advantage in manpower, as well as air, naval, and armor superiority. It has vast resources to draw on. While Ukraine has the support of much of the international community, which is providing weapons, Ukraine is fighting alone. Believing Russia's assault is going poorly may make us feel better, but is at odds with the facts. We cannot help Ukraine if we cannot be honest about its predicament. And that's from Bill Raggio at the Daily Mail. Yes, Putin is mad. Any government which finds itself opposed to the United States is mad. You know, I predicted at the time of the American invasion of Iraq that it would lead to countries, more and more countries, seeking nuclear weapons. The reason? Because that's the only thing that would stop the United States from invading your country. The only thing. And there's a piece in the American Thinker by Francis Sempa called Meet the Man Who Predicted the Ukraine War 30 years ago. Yes, I've talked about George Kennan before, but more people should become familiar with him. The standard biography of him by John Lewis Gaddis is outstanding, as are the Kennan diaries, which have been published. He begins, the Russia-Ukraine war will likely end in one of 3 ways. Russia will annex all of Ukraine and reincorporate it into Russia. Russia will install a puppet regime in Kiev and exercise effective political control over Ukraine's foreign policy. Or Russia will militarily occupy parts of Ukraine and suffer the resistance of an insurgency that may be armed and supported by outside powers. Regardless of which scenario plays out, this is and will be a tragic and unnecessary war, entirely preventable. If only the Europeans and Americans had heeded the warnings of George Kennan about the likely unintended consequences of NATO expansion. Kennan spent much of his life studying Russia, like his namesake George Kennan, a cousin of Kennan's grandfather, whom historian John Lewis Gaddis called the late 19th century's most prominent American expert on that country. George Kennan served in America's Moscow embassy from 1933 to 37, and again in 1944 to 46, from where he issued his famous long telegram that signaled the beginnings of the Cold War, and still later as U.S. ambassador to the Soviet Union in 1952. From 1947 to 1950, Kennan headed the State Department's policy planning staff and anonymously wrote his famous X article in Foreign Affairs in 1947 entitled The Sources of Soviet Conduct, in which he explained his perception of the motivations of Soviet foreign policy and recommended that the United States seek to contain Soviet Russian expansionism. Kennan used this insight in the late 1990s to warn his countrymen in Europe against expanding NATO in the wake of the West's victory in the Cold War and the collapse of the Soviet Union. The Clinton administration had made it known that NATO would be inviting Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic to join the alliance. Kennan's first public pronouncement on NATO expansion was made in October 1996 in an event held at Columbia University. He decried efforts to expand NATO as, quote, a strategic blunder of potentially epic proportions, unquote. He then wrote an article in the New York Times in February 1997 to caution American statesmen that, quote, expanding NATO would be the most fateful error of American policy in the entire post-Cold War era, unquote. Kennan was blunt in describing the probable unintended but all too foreseeable consequences of NATO expansion. Quote, such a decision may be expected to inflame the nationalistic, anti-Western, and militaristic tendencies in Russian opinion, to have an adverse effect on the development of Russian democracy, to restore the atmosphere of the Cold War to East-West relations, and to impel Russian foreign policy in directions decidedly not to our liking, unquote. There was no necessity for this move, Kennan continued, and Russians would be little impressed with American assurances that it reflects no hostile intentions. The Russians, he wrote, would see their prestige always uppermost in the Russian mind and their security interests as adversely affected. In his diaries, previously mentioned, Kennan predicted that the Russians will not react wisely and moderately to the decision of NATO to extend its boundaries to the Russian frontiers, as we have seen. But the girl bosses who run, I don't know, the Defense Department now, the State Department, run much of the Western world now, they're not interested in some old dead white man like George Kennan, because he didn't understand, the power of the girl boss. A piece by Vasco Kohlmeyer at the American Thinker. Ever since Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the Western public has been carpet bombed with the claim that Russian President Vladimir Putin is some sort of unhinged madman. This notion is being feverishly spread by the establishment and those in its pay, the political class, the media, and the commentariat, career diplomats and technocrats, as well as those connected to the security and intelligence communities. The most remarkable thing about the Mad Vlad claim is that it is obviously false. Whatever Vladimir Putin may be, he's certainly no irrational madman. This much should be obvious to everyone with eyes to see. A former KGB operative, Vladimir Putin is a wily person of demonstrated ability. After all, he managed to bring control and order to a vast country that was largely in disarray when he took it over at the age of 48. He adroitly managed to keep himself in power for over 2 decades while navigating and overcoming a number of crises and challenges along the way. Through it all, he has shown himself to be intelligent, steel-willed, calculating, shrewd, self-controlled, determined, cunning, and patient. These are hardly the qualities of a lunatic. We have dealt with Putin for 22 years, and during that whole time, no one seriously suggested or maintained that he was crazy. Quite to the contrary, for almost a decade after his ascent, he was viewed as a capable man of considerable talents. But again, he stands in the way of what the Pentagon wants, what the military-industrial complex wants. So, ipso facto, he is bonkers. And this is from Kane at Citizen Free Press. And, because this is the West versus Russia, and the West is all about, democracy and freedom. Well, kind of, sort of, and not so much anymore. People in the NATO member state of Czechia have been warned that they could face up to 3 years in prison if they express support for Russia on social media. Yes, really. The country's attorney general announced in a press release that it was, quote, necessary to inform citizens that the current situation associated with the Russian Federation's attack on Ukraine may have implications for their freedom of expression, unquote. The limitations are being imposed under the umbrella of criminal code measures that make it a crime to approve a criminal offense or deny, question, approve, or justify genocide. Quote, freedom of speech also has its limits in a democratic state governed by the rule of law, asserted the Attorney General, announcing that anyone who publicly, including at demonstrations on the internet or on social networks, agreed, accepted, or supported the Russian Federation's attacks on Ukraine, or expressed support or praised the leaders of the Russian Federation in this regard, they could also face criminal liability under certain conditions. According to a report by Radio Prague International, someone found in breach of the criminal code could be imprisoned for up to 3 years. Yes, and this is the freedom for which we should, I don't know, risk our survival, actually, because, when you say wrong things, that's not free speech. That's hate speech, or it's genocide, even. President Biden gave the State of the Union address last night, and much fun was had. Again, this is a man who supposedly has control over what they call the nuclear football. I wonder whether he actually does. And so Putin's the madman, whereas the president of the United States, who is threatening Russia with all manner of things, is senile. I mean, no one could possibly deny this. Joe Biden confuses Ukraine and Russia. Oh, vaccine can stop these diseases. Yeah, there's no wall high enough that can stop vaccines. God knows what he meant to say. Yes, Kamala appears to mouth Ukrainian when Joe Biden said Iranian. Ukrainian, Iranian. I mean, they're so close together that they're easy to be confused, right? He also spoke of a pound of Ukrainian people. Quote, Putin may circle Kiev, or as Joe Biden said last night, Kyiv, with tanks, but he'll never gain the hearts and souls of the Iranian people. He was reading off a teleprompter. Yes, Kane at Citizen Free Press asks, what the hell is Vodka Skeletor doing? And that's a reference to the Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi. And, if you said this was a deep fake, a lot of people would say, well, obviously it's a deep fake because this couldn't have been happening. Joe Biden is talking about people dying from toxic fumes, and Nancy Pelosi almost leaps out of her seat. She's standing up with a deranged grin on her face, rubbing her fists together like this. Yeah, okay. Evelyn Ray commented, someone backstage pulled on the wrong puppet strings. It's funny, but, on the other hand, it's not funny. It's frightening. This is from Eric Lundrum at American Greatness. And of course, Biden ended his speech by saying, go get him. And people, what was he talking about? American troops? Go getting them, getting the Ruskies in Ukraine? U.S. Army Forces officers to undergo training on gender identity. Now, Canada is winning this war. I mean, in terms of turning its military into a social laboratory and simply a place from which PTSD and sexual abuse allegations are filed. But America is not that far behind. Lendham writes, in the latest revelation of far-left ideologies being forced upon the United States military, new documents show that U.S. Army officers are being ordered to undergo training sessions on how to deal with soldiers with, quote, gender dysphoria. But they can't even keep their story straight because we have been told repeatedly, oh, that business about gender dysphoria, it's bunk. Okay, you don't need to have gender dysphoria in order to transition. You just need to understand that you were wrongly identified at birth. And that could happen at any time. It could happen when you were 4, Not that 4-year-olds have any understanding of what gender or sex means. It could happen at 6, 8, 10, 15, 20, 30, 50, 60, maybe. But yes, could happen at any time. The slideshow, entitled Policy on the Military Service of Transgender Persons and Persons with Gender Dysphoria, was displayed to officers in early February, with the officers being given further instructions on how to train their subordinates on the same matter. The slides were leaked by a whistleblower from Army Special Forces, and their authenticity was confirmed as mandatory training by an Army spokesman. The spokesman further confirmed that everyone in the Army, from officers to supervisors to soldiers, will be forced to complete the training by September 30th. The presentation says, inter alia, the Army allows transgender soldiers to serve openly. An otherwise qualified soldier shall not be involuntarily separated, discharged, or denied reenlistment or continuation of service on the basis of gender identity. In one scenario given by the presentation, so-called transgender soldiers who were born male but identify as female may still be treated as their biological gender while on duty if they do not request it, even if they choose to live as a woman while off duty. I guess this is what the phrase gender liquid means. However, if such a soldier later requests to be identified as a female during duty hours and or experiences increased distress relating to his gender identity, shouldn't that be their gender identity or ZER's gender identity? Then the senior officer has to inform the soldier of the Army's transgender policy and recommend that he sees a military medical provider. And this is definitely going to make the U.S. military a much stronger fighting force. So how long before Sam Elliott gets canceled? This is a story from Leah Idlibi at Mediaite. Sam Elliott really hated Jane Campion's Western drama, The Power of the Dog. The film, which leads the 2022 Academy Awards with a total of 12 nominations, is based on Thomas Savage's 1967 novel of the same name and was mostly shot across rural Otago, New Zealand. Elliott, best known for starring in Westerns throughout his career, largely took issue with the absence of the American West in Campion's film, as well as with the allusions of homosexuality. You want to talk about that piece of shit? Elliott said of the film when Mark Maron brought it up on Monday's edition of his podcast. Elliott went on to list several reasons why he took issue with The Power of the Dog. Quote, I looked at when I was down there in Texas doing 1883 and what really brought it home to me the other day when I said, do you want to, expletive, talk about it? There was an expletive full-page ad out in the LA Times, and there was a review, not a review, but a clip, and it talked about the, quote, evisceration of the American myth. And I thought, what the F? This is the guy that's done Westerns forever, the evisceration of the American West. Elliott then compared the cowboys in the movie to Chippendales dancers, saying they made it look like, what are all those dancers that those guys in New York who wear bow ties and not much else? There's all these expletive cowboys in this movie look like. They're all running around in chaps and no shirts. There's all these allusions to homosexuality throughout the expletive movie. Maron pushed back a bit, noting that he thinks that that's what the movie's about. Elliott responded, Cumberbatch never got out of his expletive chaps. He had 2 pairs of chaps, a woolly pair and a leather pair. And every expletive time he would walk in from somewhere, he was never on a horse, maybe once. He'd walk into the expletive house, storm up the expletive stairs, go lay in his bed in his chaps, and play his banjo. It's like, what the expletive? Of course, one is reminded reading this that in The Big Lebowski, Sam Elliott's character took issue with Jeff Bridges' character's prominent use of profanity. Very funny scene. But of course, as we all know, the American myth, well, no, it needs to be gayed, right? It needs to be intersectionalized. Cowboys, men out there, without women, obviously they were all homosexual, right? And that's going to be the line. That is going to be the line. And I very much wonder whether Sam Elliott will be forced to give a groveling apology or a series of apologies. Of course, Sam Elliott's an old man now, and he could just quit, if they come after him. And in more freedom news, this is from Sarah Taylor at Blaze Media or theblaze.com. Twitter suspended Representative Vicky Hartzler, Republican of Missouri, on the grounds of hateful conduct after she tweeted about biological males or transgender women competing in women's sports. Hartzler, who is running for Senator Roy Blunt's seat, tweeted on Monday, "Women's sports are for women, not men pretending to be women." She shared the sentiment from her official campaign account, which has since been deleted. And of course, this is about the University of Pennsylvania swim team, women's swim team. A spokesperson for Twitter told the outlet that if Hartzler decides to delete the tweet, the tech giant will reinstate her account within 12 hours. "We prohibit targeting others with repeated slurs, tropes," tropes, dread word, "or other content that intends to dehumanize, degrade, or reinforce negative or harmful stereotypes about a protected category." Wow, it's almost as if Twitter's has got this directly from Canada, where we have protected categories. In fact, pretty much all people are protected categories in Canada, according to the Charter of Rights and subsequent Supreme Court decisions, with one exception, white males. This includes targeted misgendering or dead naming of transgender individuals. Again, more freedom from the West. And let's go back to the chat. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about Canada. I had a piece on VDA a couple of weeks ago about the failure of Erin O'Toole as Conservative Party leader. But now the media is telling us that the next Conservative Party leader must be just like Erin O'Toole, only more so. But let's get here. Earl Pipe, new name to me, says 6'4" female breaststroke medalist. Sam Elliott apologizes to no one, says William Hicks. The wildest part of last week is how Gonzalo Lira came back from obscurity, says No Sleep Till Breezewood, Pennsylvania. In the Milius documentary, Sam Elliott says Milius makes movies for men, says Palpcasso88. Yes, I reviewed the Milius documentary a few months ago on Theater Thursday and praised it to the skies. I love John Milius. Palpcasso88 says Roadhouse is great. Respectable commenting name says, I mean, Snake Plissken in Escape from New York is up there. Interesting thing about Kurt Russell, that Kurt Russell is known and has been known for decades to have right-wing or at least, libertarian views. And I suppose the reason that he hasn't been canceled, that he still has a thriving career, is that he's just so awesome that his political views are tolerated. Emmett Kelly's Earth says, if the American army is engaging in such training, it deserves to lose any future war. Best mustache ever, says Ann Run. I know a lot of people were shocked when Sam Elliott was a character on Justified. And what happened to the mustache? They recognized Sam Elliott with his mustache. I suppose Wilford Brimley had a similar problem. Edwin says, in Eagle, Duval has a great line, a wink from a pretty girl at a party results rarely. Okay. But a man is a fool not to push a suggestion as far as it will go. Oh, in honor of Kevin, name your favorite movie characters with an eye patch. I'd say John Wayne in True Grit, Chris Eigeman in Barcelona, and Robert Duvall in The Eagle Has Landed. I love Barcelona. I love that movie. And Chris Eigeman, I just rewatched Kicking and Screaming a few days ago. Noel Baumbach's first film? It's a little picaresque, it doesn't really have a strong plot, but it's very observant, very true, and very funny. And I've always wondered why Chris Eigeman did not have a bigger career. I'm just rather mystified about it. I mean, he's a handsome man. He can act, both serious and funny. Hello to Jonathan Ferguson. Oh, Kamala. Yes, yes. I stand corrected. Donald Wadler says there is something hypocritically unseemly about Douglas Murray accusing Putin of being a sick. Jonathan Ferguson says, I protested in favor of Russia for 3 hours at the Russian embassy in Ottawa today. An RCMP officer, Officer Roy, came and forced me to cross the street and protest alongside the pro-Zelensky-ites. Respectable commenting name says, I think we can safely conclude from its persistent NATO stopped being about containment during the Cold War and became about what Mr. Grace refers to as ethnic animus. Well, about that, Irving Kristol, the godfather of conservatism, a very clever and wise man, started arguing around 1980 that NATO served no purpose and should be disbanded. And of course, there was absolutely no possible reason for NATO to exist after the Soviet Union was formally dissolved in 1991. But then a bunch of boys and girls would lose their jobs, wouldn't they? And I don't know, Raytheon stock might decrease in price. Zen Master says Putin is basically saying, go ahead, punk, make my day. He said it in his speech, but they don't listen. They keep poking. Dr. Deadname says the NPC meme went dormant and then came back big time. Oh, I've wasted my life. Yo Mama, that would be the comic book guy in The Simpsons, right? Yes, yes, Yo Mama confirms. Justin Proto, so Choking 666, you should check out on the Reddit mercenary thread. It's hilarious. Gendered pronouns are discussed. Okay, so let's talk about my benighted country of Canada. And so much concern trolling going on now that Aaron O'Toole, oh, he was a dangerous man. He called himself True Blue, you know, whatever that means. It means nothing, actually. There's a woman called Tasha Karedin who's been, political hack for decades. She has been she's worked in radio as an opinion columnist, but of course she is also a PR spiv, a navigator. And again, I think she may be on leave from Navigator as she currently explores a candidacy for the conservative leadership. Okay. Yes. And I think run, Tasha, run. Here's another, obligatory Simpsons reference as Leonard Nimoy said to Krusty the Clown, the world needs laughter. Canada needs the ability to defend itself in an increasingly uncertain world. For decades now, the only conceivable military threat to Canada is the United States of America. Stephen Harper attempted to gin up this fear of Russia. No, Russia already has more frozen wasteland than it can use. Oh, but the mineral resources of Nunavut, no, nothing's happening there. The costs of mining, in a place that last time I checked had something like 20 miles of roads, the cost of mining in these places is prohibitive. And in fact, the cost of mining in Alaska even is almost prohibitive. The number of years it takes and the billions of dollars just to get started, no. Oh, and of course, Tasha Karedin spells Zelensky's name ending with 2 Y's. These words, she writes, have also brought home a chilling reality. War is not a thing of the past, and unless you have the means to fight it, you depend on the good graces and strategic calculations of other nation states. A strong military is not a luxury, it is a necessity, and Canada needs to up its game. I remember in 2003, I interviewed a professor at the University of Calgary who told me effectively that the Canadian military was bust and was going to remain must because all of their weapon systems had failed over time. And the amount of money to replace just one of these weapon systems would be stupendous. To replace all of them, never going to happen. Never going to happen. I have not in my lifetime heard a serious public discussion of what the purpose of Canada's military is. The Canadian Forces, they're called. Not the Canadian Armed Forces, because that would be a little too macho, manly, perhaps a micro aggression. It's just absolutely preposterous. Absolutely preposterous. Carrying on about, oh, the Canadian military, yeah, definitely. All these governments come to power in Canada and say, oh, no, we're going to end our neglect of the Canadian military and start spending serious money. Nope. Nope, because it can't be done. Oh, first, Ottawa should match Berlin and increase defense spending to 2% of GDP, up from 1.4% in 2020. Canada is bankrupt. It's bankrupt. But of course, that doesn't stop the Canadian government from sending hundreds of millions of dollars. Oh, sorry, borrowing hundreds of millions of dollars. It doesn't have to give to the Ukraine. So I guess that, if Tasha decides to run, and once again, run, Tasha, run, the world needs laughter. She is going to be the strongest on defense. Again, it's never been an issue in Canadian elections. There's no missile gap in Canadian military, Canadian political history. There's no, oh no, we got to increase our defense spending because of various threats. No, it's never happened. Someone called Althea Raj at the Toronto Sun has a piece called Pierre Poilievre offers right-wing populism to the Conservatives. Will they take him up on it? Party members who haven't rallied to his campaign are hoping for a more mature candidate with a unifying message. Aaron O'Toole. Well, I'll give you one example, which you can find in detail in my VDR essay. Aaron O'Toole bent over backwards to outflank, sorry about the mixed metaphor, ugly mixed metaphor there, to outflank the Liberals and the NDP as the pro-alphabet people party. Let's legalize poppers. We have to force Canadian Blood Services to accept donations from male homosexuals at any time with no restrictions, and on and on and on. Forcing his kid, like his 10-year-old kid, to wear a pink shirt with some inane message on it. And what was his reward for this? Well, after he was gone, Dale Smith, who writes for one of those gay rags, I think Extra, effectively said, a day late and a dollar short. That you didn't become an ally until fairly recently. So no, it's not good enough. And it's never going to be good enough for these people. What sort of people allow their enemies to define their terms of engagement? Why, we call those people conservatives with a big C or a small c. Bruce Anderson, who for some reason is an influential man in my country, and he is a pollster and currently chairman of Abacus Data. Oh, he is also chairman of Summit Communications. So he's a PR spiv and a pollster. And he's done a bunch of polling about what likely conservative voters will want. What kind of leader the federal Conservatives need if they want to win? Well, there's a name for this. Chomsky and Herman coined it. It's called manufactured consent. And it's based on the assumption that current trends, I don't know, like say last week's trend, continues forever. That things will always be the same. Now, of course, Brexit was never going to pass in the United Kingdom, and Trump was never going to be elected president because things were always going to remain the same. And what does the polling say? That the new conservative leader has to be just gayer than gay, and climate change got to, hold that tightly to the bosom. Look, there's never been a politician in Canada with the guts to say this is nonsense. It's all nonsense. Because if that happened, things would shift very quickly. But no, if the Conservatives are paying any attention to anything the media has to say about who their next leader should be, well, they deserve everything that they are likely to get. I'm rather leaning, well, Tasha Karedin, she's the dream Conservative Party leader, because under her, the Conservatives would be reduced to, I don't know what, 20 seats. Maybe she could rival Kim Campbell, who brought the Conservatives down from, what was it, 168 seats to 2. Yes, 1-2. Yes. Conservative Party's first female leader and Canada's first female prime minister. And more in that vein, provocative piece by Matt Ridley, who is, I believe, the science editor of the Telegraph, most recently co-author of Viral, The Search for the Origin of COVID-19 with Alina Chan. It's a piece and spiked online why global warming is good for us. Climate change is creating a greener, safer planet. I should point out that after Russia, Canada is the second coldest country in the world. And none of these lunatics who are attempting openly to destroy our economy and making it impossible for, I don't know, Canadians to live in homes or even apartments because they won't be able to afford to heat them, none of them take into account the fact of how cold Canada is. Oh, because this is all about the world. Oh, so, but if China and India don't go along, then anything that Canada does makes no difference. But I digress. Ridley begins global warming is real. It is also so far mostly beneficial. This startling fact is kept from the public by a determined effort on the part of alarmists and their media allies who are determined to use the language of crisis and emergency. The goal of net zero emissions in the UK by 2050 is controversial enough as a policy because of the pain it is causing. 2050, that's 28 years from now, and it is already crippling Britons financially with heating bills already. But what if all of that pain is to prevent something that is not doing net harm? The biggest benefit of emissions is global greening, the increase year after year of green vegetation on the land surface of the planet. Forests grow more thickly, grasslands more richly, and scrub more rapidly. This has been measured using satellites and on-the-ground recording of plant growth rates. It is happening in all habitats from tundra to rainforest. In the 4 decades since 1982, as Bjorn Lomborg points out, NASA data show that global greening has added 618,000 square kilometers of extra green leaves each year, equivalent to 3 Great Britons. You read that right. Every year there's more greenery on the planet to the extent of 3 Britons. I bet Greta Thunberg did not tell you that. The cause of this greening? Although tree planting, natural reforestation, slightly longer growing seasons, and a bit more rain all contribute, the big cause is something else. All studies agree that by far the largest contributor to global greening, responsible for roughly half the effect, is the extra carbon dioxide in the air. In 40 years, the proportion of the atmosphere that is CO2 has gone from 0.034% to 0.041%. That may seem a small change, but with more food in the air, plants don't need to lose as much water through their pores, stomata, to acquire a given amount of carbon. So dry areas like the Sahel region of Africa are seeing some of the biggest improvements in greenery. Since this is one of the poorest places on the planet, it is good news that there is more food for people, goats, and wildlife. Excuse me. Ridley continues, but because good news is no news, green pressure groups and environmental correspondents in the media prefer to ignore global greening. Astonishingly, it merited no mentions on the BBC's recent Green Planet series, despite the name. Or, if it is mentioned, the media points to studies suggesting greening may soon cease. These studies are based on questionable models, not data, because data show the effect continuing at the same pace. On the very few occasions when the BBC has mentioned global greening, it is always accompanied by a health warning In case any viewer might glimpse a silver lining to climate change, for example, extra foliage helps slow climate change, but researchers warn this will be offset by rising temperatures. Another bit of good news is on deaths. We're against them, right? A recent study shows that rising temperatures have resulted in 500,000 fewer deaths in Britain over the past 2 decades. That is because cold weather kills about 20 times as many people as hot weather, according to the study, which analyzes over 74 million deaths in 384 locations across 13 countries. This is especially true in a temperate place like Britain, where summer days are rarely hot enough to kill. So global warming and the unrelated phenomenon of urban warming relative to rural areas caused by the retention of heat by buildings plus energy use are both preventing premature deaths on a huge scale. I'll just say for my own part, if average temperatures were to rise, say 2 degrees Celsius, or 2.5 degrees Celsius, that would give Victoria, British Columbia, where I live, in my view, the best climate on Earth. Ridley continues, surely this will change in the future? Probably not. Britain would have to get much, much hotter for summer mortality to start exceeding winter deaths. Not even Greece manages that. And the statistics show that, as greenhouse gas theory predicts, on the whole, more warming is happening in cold places, in cold seasons, and at cold times of day. So winter nighttime temperatures in the global north are rising much faster than summer daytime temperatures in the tropics. I'll also mention that recently in several cities in British Columbia last week recorded record low temperatures. But of course, weather is not climate. Actually, weather is climate over time, but they don't like to talk about that. Summer temperatures in the US are changing at half the rate of winter temperatures, and daytimes are warming 20% slower than nighttimes. A similar pattern is seen in most countries. Alarmists love to talk about polar amplification of average climate change, but they usually omit its inevitable flip side, that tropical temperatures where most poor people live are changing more slowly than the average. But are we not told to expect more volatile weather as a result of climate change? It is certainly assumed that we should, yet there's no evidence to suggest weather volatility is increasing, and no good theory to suggest that it will. The decreasing temperature differential between the tropics and the Arctic may actually diminish the volatility of weather a little. Indeed, as the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change repeatedly confirms, there is no clear pattern of storms growing in either ferocity or frequency. Droughts are decreasing slightly, and floods are getting worse only where land use changes, like deforestation or building houses on floodplains, create a problem. Globally, deaths from droughts, floods, and storms are down by about 98% over the past 100 years, not because weather is less dangerous, but because shelter, transport, and communication, which are mostly the products of the fossil fuel economy, have dramatically improved people's abilities to survive such natural disasters. The geological record, Ridley continues, shows greater climatic volatility in cold periods of the Earth's history than in hot periods. The effect of today's warming and greening on farming is on average positive. Crops can be grown farther north and for longer seasons, and rainfall is slightly heavier in dry regions. We are feeding over 7 billion people today, much more easily than we fed 3 billion in the 1960s, and from a similar acreage of farmland. Global cereal production is on course to break its record this year for the 6th time in 10 years. Nature, too, will do generally better in a warming world. There are more species in warmer climates, so more new birds and insects are arriving to breed in southern England than are disappearing from northern Scotland. Warmer means wetter, too. 9,000 years ago, when the climate was warmer than today, the Sahara was green. Alarmists like to imply that concern about climate change goes hand in hand with concern about nature generally, but this is belied by the evidence. Climate policies often harm wildlife. Biofuels compete for land with agriculture, eroding the benefits of improved agricultural productivity and increasing pressure on wild land. Wind farms kill birds and bats, and the reckless planting of alien Sitka spruce trees turns diverse moorland into dark monoculture. And again, this long essay by Matt Ridley, and you can find it at spiked-online.com. And I've neglected this. Joseph Tainter, but I'm going to go back to him here. He keeps slogging away at the collapse of complex societies. And in this chapter, he is discussing historical explanations for collapsed societies. And after a discussion of Plato, he moves to Polybius, who, in a remarkable 2nd century BC anticipation of the Roman collapse some 6 centuries later, continued the biological analogy. Quote, every organism, every state, and every activity passes through a natural cycle, first of growth, then of maturity, and finally of decay, unquote. The victory of Rome over Carthage was accounted for by the fact that Rome was ascending this cycle and Carthage declining at the time of their conflict. Rome was then at its zenith, but changes for the worse were to follow. This stage, wrote Polybius, will pass through a natural cycle to its decay. The decline of Rome was a source of speculation from the 2nd century BC until the final collapse. Sallust ascribed Roman decadence to loss of virtue and the biological cycle. Everything that is born dies. Actually, yes, this is very true. Michelangelo wrote a famous sonnet. Everything that is created must decay. To Seneca the Elder, the decline of Italian agriculture was a sign of social-cultural age. Such thinking became commonplace on the onset of true crisis in the 3rd century AD. Cyprian's views on the matter have been quoted earlier in this chapter. To Ammianus Marcellinus in the 4th century, Rome had gone through a phase of childhood with wars in her immediate vicinity, adulthood when she crossed the Alps and the sea, youth and manhood, the time of great triumphs, and was now declining into old age. Ambrose, Bishop of Milan, and Vitigius, both contemporaries of Ammianus Marcellinus, seconded the theme of decadence. To pagans of the era, the blame for Rome's troubles was to be placed on Christians, and to Christians, the barbarians and other troubles were the judgments of God for Roman sins and transgressions. St. Augustine wrote his City of God in response to the pagan charges, completed 426 AD. Augustine's theory was that there were 2 kinds of persons, the good inhabitants of the City of God, who would be purified and improved by the troubles, and the evil, who loved worldly things and would be overwhelmed. In the 14th century, Petrarch explained the fall of Rome by the disappearance of great men. Later, what was apparently the first decline and fall was written by Flavio Biondo, 1392 to 1463. His Historium and I'm not going to attempt to pronounce that, but you know what I mean, covers the years 412 to 1441. To Flavio Biondo, the collapse was attributable to the persecution of the Christians, the deterioration of moral life, and the arrival of inferior types of humanity. Leonardo Bruni Aretino, 1441, was similar on this last point. The government was transferred into the worst hands and so fell. To Antonio Agostino, a 15th century bishop of Lerida, and to most Renaissance thinkers, the Roman decline was due to abandonment of ancient manners. Machiavelli, in his discourses on Livy, argued that the Romans won their early wars by their virtue, but when later this virtue was lacking and the armies had lost their ancient valor, the Western Empire was destroyed. Rome came to this condition when it was corrupted by its colonies. A great power becomes dependent on its colonies, and thus a colony itself. Interesting diversions from this tradition were provided by Rheticus and Jean Baudin. Rheticus, a disciple of Copernicus, proposed, 1540 to 43, a Copernican explanation of collapse. The rise and fall of monarchies was tied to the terrestrial orbit and the sun's eccentricities. To Jean Baudin, the birth and death of states was deterministically regulated by the perfect number 496. Baudin's tradition has been continued into recent times by at least 2 authors. Quetelet wrote in 1848 that 5 ancient empires each lasted an average of 1,461 years, which in Egyptian numerology is the lifespan of the phoenix. Lawler, 1970, believes history is cyclic, following a 1470 rise and fall pattern. Each such pattern contains 2 subpatterns of 735 years, in turn broken down into 10 phases. The collapse of the United States is predicted by 2040. Montesquieu's major work on the rise and fall of Rome continued the morality argument. Roman power derived from Roman virtue, and when this declined, the Romans weakened. Under the emperors, the populace became a vile mob. Campaigning beyond Italy led to a decline in civic spirit among the soldiers. Epicureanism undermined the moral order. Rome gradually declined until collapse came under the emperors Arcadius and Honorius, circa 400 AD. Gibbon, 1776 to 88, cited a number of factors in the Roman collapse, including relaxation of military discipline, Christianity, ignorance of dangers, bad emperors, and the decline of martial spirit with prosperity. Herder, circa 1791, believed that all human structures were transitory and become oppressive within a few generations. Rome would, in the end, have been destroyed by class conflict or the military, but the proximate cause was the importation of luxuries, leading to depraved, indolent living, vices, divorce, slavery, and tyranny toward the best persons. The population declined in numbers, stature, and vital energy. Hegel's History of Philosophy originated in a series of lectures in 1830 and 31. Hegel believed that a polity is well constituted when the private interests of the citizens are one with the common interests of the state. But since material cravings, instincts, and self-interest present themselves first, some time is needed to achieve this point. A nation is moral and virtuous while pursuing its grand objects, but once these are realized, once opposition vanishes, the supreme interest also vanishes and the spirit of the people disappears. A nation lives the same kind of life as an individual, passing from maturity to an old age in which there is satisfaction at accomplishment. This customary life brings on natural death, and a people then perish. Curious perspectives on disintegration were offered by the Adams brothers, Brooks and Henry, distinguished historians and descendants of American presidents, including, of course, John Quincy Adams. Brooks Adams, in 1896, believed that the properties of the mind are strongly hereditary. Human societies vary in respect to how nature has endowed them with energetic material. When a race is so richly endowed with energetic material that not all is expended in the daily struggle, the surplus may be stored in the form of wealth. Capitalism may result therefrom, as well as emphasis on economic and scientific intellect. Class stratification is inevitable and can lead to collapse. In Rome, a martial, energetic race was exterminated by the usurers and landowners. The Romans were ill-fitted to endure the strain of the unrestricted economic competition of a centralized society. The energy of such a race becomes exhausted, and the survivors must await the infusion of barbarian blood. Henry Adams' thesis, 1919, was that human thought has passed through a series of phases. Thought is analogous to an electric current and obeys laws of inertia. Phases of thought accelerate through time at a rate equal to the square root of the time of the previous phase. The evolution of thought has now passed its apex and is in a retrograde. Thought, he predicted, would reach the limits of its possibilities in 1921 or barring that in 2025. Otto von Zieck's theory of the Roman collapse was a biological one. Massacres of the residents of Italy in the last centuries of the Republic led to elimination of the best parts of the population and subsequent governance by the remainder. For a revival of dysgenic thinking, see Shockley. George Hansen in 1889 developed a similar theory based on Roman marriage patterns. Tenny Frank believed that racial change in Italy brought a people lacking energy, enterprise, foresight, and common sense. Burckhardt, originally 1852, threw his weight behind the senescence and corruption explanation of the Roman collapse. And I'll have more from Joseph Tainter tomorrow. Oh, yeah. Let's talk about NGOs, non-governmental organizations, which are evil and need to be destroyed. But instead, they continue to gain power. They are the perfect fig leaf for a ravenous government. No, see, it's not us doing it. It is these entirely independent organizations, but your government funds them. Oh, no, but that does not take away their individuality, their neutrality. they always say the things that you want them to say. Well, that's merely a coincidence, isn't it? I mean, look at to give one example, the numerous number of NGOs in Canada or from abroad that operate in Canada that are telling us all what's what about hate speech and about misinformation and disinformation. They're all astroturf organizations that get their money or the bulk of it from Ottawa. And yet our media, which of course is in on the game, they just report this as if it is disinterested analysis. But let's take a look at the chat here before I go into a detailed discussion of NGOs. Tom Willis says, let's talk about GeoCities. Palpcasso 88 says NGOs should be banned. Donald Wadler says, Willis, they can't touch the red pill psychologically. They will have to let us be or kill us. Hello to Hauper. Any Hegelites in the chat, asks Hauper. Oscar Toe says, do I have to sing We Are the World to these hateful warmongering libs now? Have they forgotten that powerful message of peace? This rather stumped me for some time. Because, you know, Tony Blair marching against the Vietnam War, Bill Clinton marching against the Vietnam War, the whole generation of 1968 around the West, you know, marching against the Vietnam War, you know, demanding, you know, abolish the CIA and, you know, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Why is it that when these people came to power, things got worse in that respect? Well, Vietnam wasn't their war. They didn't start it. They weren't in charge of it. And it was politically useful for them to be against it. But they came up with their own wars. I mean, I even say in Serbia in 1999, which is certainly stranger than Vietnam, right? Because it serves their interest. And of course, there was much talk in the 1960s from leftists about, you know, repression. Of course, the repression is far greater than it was in the 1960s. But who's running things now? The leftists are running things, although they call themselves, they have morphed into neoconservatives or neoliberals or globalists or the deep state. Hey, you remember a few years ago when the deep state was a conspiracy theory and you should be ashamed even to use those words? And do you remember how, I believe it was last year, various members of the deep state came out of the closet, as it were, and said, yeah, there's a deep state and I'm part of it. And the deep state is a good thing because it keeps people like Donald Trump down. We're all in favor of democracy, except, you know, for when the bad guy wins. Then it's not democracy anymore. And who else do we have in the chat? Yes, shouldn't that be Hegelians, says Anne Run. Zen Master says, my wish is to take my grandchildren to the Sam Hyde statue with some roast chicken sandwiches and a flask of coffee and watch the kids feeding the birds while I clean pigeon poop off Sam. We've been gaslit for so long, they almost drove us crazy. We relied on each other to check ourselves. We have been reduced to the strongest core of reason, fire-tested, battle-hardened. We win. Again, from Don Willis. Oh, anybody new in the chat? What we need to do as conservatives is stop considering any other opinions or avenues. Boldly run, campaign, and take office. No focus groups, no consulting, never bend. Stay true to our convictions. Well, yeah, I think that's all good advice, except best advice, stop calling ourselves conservatives. That's the banner of our enemies. And you get into these ridiculous fights about, no, a real conservative wouldn't do A, B, or C, all right? And conservatism is really about surrendering to your enemies, to the people who want you, you know, brainwashed, kidnapped, raped, dead, and think it's funny. Because just read Edmund Burke or Tocqueville, and you'll find it all there. They keep on with this, yeah. They keep on with this. Donald Wadler says, I could imagine how much KMG likes Barcelona, even though I was liberal when it came out and liked it too. It pushed me rightward. I was shocked at how beautiful Barcelona is, and of course, well, how beautiful the women are, although that movie came out, in the 1990s, and if Barcelona is going the same way as other Western cities, then the women there will be significantly less attractive than they were. Hello to Half a Galician. The Canadian trucker things seems so long ago now. Oh, yeah, thank you for reminding me of that. This is from Guy Quenneville at CBC. Convoy organizer Tamara Lich to remain in jail at least 5 more days. Tamara Lich, 49, was behind a now halted GoFundMe campaign that raised more than $10 million to support the protest in Ottawa, which became a weeks-long occupation. Oh, don't you mean insurrection? She was arrested February 17th and charged with counseling to commit mischief shortly before the major push by police to clear out the remaining protesters who occupied downtown Ottawa streets. Lich was then denied bail on February 22nd, but appealed, leading to Wednesday's bail review. The original judge said she was not convinced Lich would go home and stop her alleged counseling. Yeah, she was brought into the court in shackles, which caused some shock. And I believe the defense suggested that the shackles be removed, and the Crown prosecutor spoke out very strongly against removing the shackles from this 51-year-old woman because she is so physically dangerous. Yes, more freedom from the West. So there's a piece in Unheard by Connor Fitzgerald yesterday. In Ireland, it's progressives who have the real power. Working in the shadows, they are using NGOs to protect elite consensus. If one political innovation has defined Ireland's move from its conservative past to its current status as the poster child for hyper-liberalization, it's been the rise of the NGO. But in the last month, some cracks have appeared in the ways that NGOs protect and define elite consensus in the country. Last month, the National Women's Council of Ireland announced a No Women Left Behind rally outside the Irish Parliament to take place on the 5th of March. The event will feature speakers from a number of parties, but none from government, who were deemed insufficiently active in tackling violence against women. This led to protests from a number of female ministers angered that they were being denied some of the sweet credibility and reputational enhancement they felt entitled to, having opened the government purse strings for the organization. Senator Regina Doherty said that the Women's Council was failing to represent a wide range of views and critically noted that the organization is almost entirely state-funded, and she is right. The NWCI's latest annual report shows that it received over 800,000 euros in funding from various government bodies in 2020 versus less than 40,000 euros raised from its own members. This is a typical arrangement in a country that has around 33,000 NGOs. The state funds them to the tune of about 5 billion euros every year, comprising 8% of the national budget. I'm going to repeat that. The Irish state funds NGOs to the tune of about 5 billion euros every year, comprising 8% of the national budget. For context, the Irish Health Service, its largest single item of expenditure, got a 21 billion euros in the last budget. The organizations funded are almost exclusively socially progressive. The National Council of Women has historically been a relatively neutral organization, but in recent years, it has adopted increasingly progressive positions, such as signing a letter asking the government to no-platform gender-critical voices. This is reflective of a broader socio-cultural drift to the left in Ireland, which has seen the introduction of an immigration amnesty, gender self-ID, and hate speech laws. In each case, the government kept the right kind of NGOs close at hand in reaching their final position. But no immigration restrictionist, free speech, or gender-critical NGOs are recipients of an ounce of government largesse. The money all goes on the other side of the scale. The large number of Catholic or Catholic-aligned organizations funded by the state are either silent on these issues or actively on the progressive side. And nowadays, NGOs are simply too powerful, too useful, and too deeply embedded in the decision-making process to be removed. The current spat between government and the National Women's Council of Ireland is the incipient end of a happy marriage. It's more akin to the mob boss who is offended when the mayor in his pocket won't consent to them being photographed together. I pay for your lifestyle, but you won't be seen with me? There has already been some rapprochement between the government and the NWCI, and the Minister of Equality has quickly noted that a funding change was not on the agenda. In the end, it seems the government was able to reach a solution that worked for everyone, both the partisan NGOs and the politicians who make use of their activism. It also shut down Benefact, the public body that tracks and reports on NGO funding with immediate effect. In future, finding out who is funding partisan activism in Ireland will be as opaque as the activist organizations themselves. Welcome to life in the Irish public square. Yes, more freedom from the West. And again, this was a piece that appeared yesterday at unheard.com. That's UNHERD by Connor Fitzgerald. You know, when you look at, let's say, to give one example, Stephen Harper's government. You know, he didn't want to be seen as, well, right-wing, although he was pilloried as an extreme right-winger. What an extreme right-winger would have done, or anyone who cared about transparency, justice, etc., would be to zero out the NGOs. Every single one of them. Zero them out. Oh, what about the, Canadian Cancer Society or the Canadian Lung Association or whatever? What do these groups actually do now to prevent people getting cancer, or with regard to cancer treatment, or, lung disease? No, they just shout about politics, particularly the politics that the government or, the government party wants. That's what they do. And they need to be zeroed out, every single one of them. Now, the PR spivs, not going to be happy about that at all. And the PR spivs are exceedingly powerful. They can be said to run the Conservative Party in Canada, a gay PR spiv cabal. But, I guess they'll have to just suffer a little. If the work of the Canadian Cancer Society is so vital, then presumably Canadians would dig into their own pockets in order to fund it. And finally, oh, no, not finally. Oh, yes. You remember if you suggested that these jabs were gene therapy, you'd be canceled because that was ridiculous? It was a conspiracy theory? Well, this is from Kane at Citizen Free Press. The messenger RNA, mRNA from Pfizer's COVID vaccine is able to enter human liver cells and is converted into DNA, according to Swedish researchers at Lund University. The researchers found that when the mRNA vaccine enters the human liver cells, it triggers the cell's DNA, which is inside the nucleus, to increase the production of the line 1 gene expression to make our mRNA. The mRNA then leaves the nucleus and enters the cell's cytoplasm, where it translates into line 1 protein. A segment of the protein called the open reading frame 1, or ORF1, then goes back into the nucleus, where it attaches to the vaccine's mRNA and reverse transcribes into spike DNA. Well, the whole process occurred rapidly within 6 hours. The vaccine's mRNA converting into DNA and being found inside the cell's nucleus is something that the CDC said would not happen. The genetic material developed by mRNA vaccines never enters the nucleus of your cells, the CDC claimed falsely on its webpage titled Myths and Facts about COVID-19 vaccines. I can hardly wait for the show trials, the trillion-dollar fines, and the imprisonments, and the disgrace and banishing from social and intellectual life of everyone responsible for this in all the countries of the West and all those who led for it. This is still early days with regard to this. How is it going to turn out? Well, we don't know, do we? We simply don't know. That's what experimental means. Let's go to Alex Berenson's Substack, Unreported Truth, and he has an excellent book that came out a couple of months ago called Pandemia. Kiss my unvaccinated ass, Brandon. So tonight, Uncle Joe said we shouldn't politicize COVID. Oh, and here's an earlier story. Biden grappling with pandemic of the unvaccinated. That's July 16th, 2021. Biden blames Delta variant unvaccinated people for weaker than expected jobs report. December of last year, Biden, unvaxxed will overwhelm hospitals in winter of illness and death. January 4th, 2022, Biden, no excuse for anyone being unvaccinated. This continues to be a pandemic of the unvaccinated. Berenson comments, I'm old enough to remember when he encouraged social media platforms to censor me in July, or when his Department of Homeland Security called me a terrorist threat 3 weeks ago. I'm old enough to remember how the Democrats closed schools and businesses and tried to make me wear a mask and get vaccinated, and then lied about all of it. Now the walls are coming down and they're begging us to forget what they've done to reset. Here's my State of the Union, Joe, not a snowball's chance in hell. And the censorship has to stop from Berenson. Instead, it's worsening day by day. Whatever you think of the drug that can't be mentioned or anything else, the banning of honest or dishonest dissent is profoundly dangerous. And in a post called Berenson versus Biden from 10 hours ago, I'm starting to think I need to file a First Amendment lawsuit over that insane bulletin from the Department of Homeland Security, February 7th. In case you've forgotten, that report, a public declaration of the federal government's official view of terrorism, called the top terrorist threat to the United States, quote, false or misleading narratives which sow discord or undermine public trust in U.S. government institutions, unquote. Their words, not mine. Berenson comments, trying to undermine public trust in U.S. government institutions is now a terrorist act. Then I am a terrorist, especially since the bulletin specifically mentions COVID-19. There is widespread online proliferation of false or misleading narratives regarding unsubstantiated widespread election fraud and COVID-19. There's that word misleading again, Berenson comments. As the White House has made clear, misleading facts are those that lead people to opinions or conclusions it doesn't like. No one has knocked on my door or threatened to arrest me, but does that mean the government is not targeting me along with other prominent COVID and vaccine skeptics? Per the bulletin, the Department of Homeland Security in 2021 expanded its evaluation of online activity as part of its efforts to assess and prevent acts of violence. The government has other tools against people it classifies as terrorists too, including plenty of secret ones. And remember, to be a terrorist under these terms, your speech simply has to, quote, potentially inspire acts of violence, potentially. If this isn't a government effort to discourage lawful speech, I don't know what it is. The question is whether it is so broad and dangerous that I can prove it will have a chilling and unconstitutional effect on me and other people, even if I do not know that I'm being targeted. It feels like a form of prior restraint, all the worse for being so broad. Will courts agree? There may be only one way to find out. You know, when the Unabomber was arrested, it was discovered that he was a great admirer of Al Gore's book, Earth in the Balance, that he'd studied it, you know, underlining all these passages, all that sort of thing, which led idiots on the right, or the soi-disant right, to blame Al Gore for the Unabomber. No, Al Gore was not responsible for the Unabomber. Any piece, any monograph, or any piece of literature can be blamed for almost any act. That's not the way that it is supposed to work. And let's take a look at dailyskeptic.org. And News Roundup. COVID modeling cannot accurately predict numbers, admits government expert. Wow. Just the walls are collapsing. The walls are collapsing. William Briggs has pointed out many, many times, models tell exactly what you tell them to say. You're all familiar with that game, The Sims, right? Well, why do the characters in The Sims act the way they do? As the result of modeling. That The Sims assumes that Richard Dawkins' selfish gene theory is correct. And all human behavior that you see in The Sims is based on this assumption. And more inconvenient news on global temperatures from the graph that Google doesn't want you to see. Vaccine mandates for NHS workers and care home workers scrapped. Average UK energy bills could hit £3,000 a year. Yes, and there is a skeptical take on the Ukraine crisis by Noah Carl. He says in a recent post with the Daily Skeptic, Toby Young claims that the received wisdom on the Ukraine crisis is basically right, noting that he's experienced the unusual sensation of feeling more in step with the mainstream media than I have with my skeptical friends. While he makes some good points, I don't think he really steelmans the skeptical position. Toby concludes that saying when a strongman leader uses his country's superior military force to subjugate an independent sovereign state to his will, my natural inclination is to side with the underdog. But this isn't the right way to frame the issue. I'm certainly not on Putin's side. Incidentally, Toby says he supported the war in Iraq, even though that involved a leader whom some people considered a kind of strongman, using his country's superior military force to invade and occupy an independent sovereign state. And finally, I'm going to talk about Playboy magazine. Playboy magazine, I suppose, is still around. I don't believe that it's printed anymore. I think it's just on the internet. In any event, it hasn't been a cultural force for decades. It was very much a cultural force in the United States and in much of the West in the 1950s, 1960s, and 1970s. There is a very funny bit in a novel by an English novelist. It concerns an American professor, a sort of ugly American type, who is spending a year in Birmingham on an exchange program, whereas the English professor goes to the United States, changing places, it's called. And so the American professor has this collection of Playboy magazines. This is in the recent past, and he has this housekeeper, or this young Irish woman from the West Country, who's caught reading the magazines, and there is much embarrassing and shouting, and later, to the consternation of the American professor, the woman's serving woman's father, who is an Irish physician, shyly asks whether he could borrow the stash of Playboy magazines. And the American professor, he couldn't figure this out. I've corrupted, an Irish Catholic, and he was pleased at that. Later, he was infuriated when he found out that the Irish doctor wasn't reading Playboy to look at the nudes. He was looking at the ads, because this was America. And apparently in America, everyone was fabulously rich, and all of these, consumer items, which were far beyond the ken of even a professional man, like a physician in Ireland, they're just routine in America. Very, very amusing. And of course, I'm reminded of something that was reported about Pope Pius XII. The Vatican in the Age of Dictators. Actually, it was Anthony Rhodes's book. It was his follow-up to that one, In the Age of Democracies. That Pius XII was very keen to hear from priests, Catholic priests all over the world. and they would visit the Vatican, and he would have conversations with them. So near the end of his reign, he died in 1958, he was speaking to an American priest, a visiting American priest. So, he was asking about cultural trends in America. So the priest talked about the phenomenal success of Playboy magazine. By 1960, which is not quite the 50s, well, technically it's still part of the 1950s, Playboy magazine had over 1 million subscribers in a supposedly puritanical, straight-laced, repressive country. Over 1 million subscribers in 1960. But when the population of the United States was like roughly half of what it is today. Anyway, so Pope Pius asked this priest to explain the success of Playboy magazine. And the priest said that he didn't think that it was such a terribly bad thing because the success was due to the fact that the people who bought and read Playboy magazine were interested in the beauty of the nudity. And the Pope responded, on the contrary, I believe they're far more interested in the nudity of the beauty. Playboy magazine, for decades, it became semi-respectable. That famous people, the people that you would see in television, the movies, would do Playboy spreads. But the magazine went very much down market, particularly from the 1980s. The best book about Playboy is by the English writer, Russell Miller, who did a great work on L. Ron Hubbard. And it's called Bunny. Excellent book. Actually, everything by Russell Miller is great. I suppose part of the reason for the decline of Playboy was its involvement in what he describes, and perhaps what other people describe, as the pubic wars, the circulation battle with Bob Guccione's Penthouse. And after that, it was difficult for Playboy to pretend that it could be in any way, classy. A few years ago, there was a documentary about Hugh Hefner, and his bunnies. And it was a documentary made by women. I forget its title. It would be easy to find it out, though. That apparently Playboy and the bunny clubs were liberating for women. Oh, okay. That you're going to take farm fresh nubals and you're going to dress them up as animals for the delectation of horny men. That certainly sounds very liberating. But, Hef was a champion of sexual liberation, not just practically, in showing ever more graphic nudes and acts of sexuality themselves in his publications. But, he was a philosopher as well. And he wrote a column called the Playboy Philosophy. It was hundreds, thousands, millions of words. There's a hilarious scene in Bob Fosse's Star 80 where Dorothy Stratton's husband, Paul Snider, who eventually murdered her, he's just over the moon meeting Hef. And he reads out a lengthy quotation, which he's obviously memorized, and it is a big chunk from one of Hugh Hefner's Playboy philosophy essays. And Hefner, just a how would I say, a dickish move, no pun intended, he corrects a minor inaccuracy in the quotation instead of being thrilled that anyone would remember this bump. It's also very amusing in Star 80 when Hefner makes it very clear to Dorothy Stratton that he doesn't think that Paul Snider, she should be involved with Paul Snider, because Hef says he has the personality of a pimp. And I thought, this is absolutely perfect. Does Hugh Hefner have no idea of the business that he is in? Which leads us to this latest controversy. It's described in an article by Amy Kaufman in the LA Times 2 days ago. For the last month, PJ Maston's Facebook inbox has been filled with death threats. You're a piece of this, you're a liar, you're a something this and something that, she says, repeating some of the messages she's received She is no stranger to public attacks. In 2014, she alleged she had once been drugged and raped by Bill Cosby, a claim later echoed by dozens of women. But speaking out against nude magazine impresario Hugh Hefner has roused far more vitriol, she says, not only for tarring the reputation of a beloved public figure, but for breaking ranks with a tight-knit community, Playboy itself. It's all from bunnies, says Maston, referring to the waitresses whose uniforms at the once famous Playboy clubs paid homage to the company's mascot. These are 85-year-old women running around with their bunny ears on, and I'm bursting their bubble. Being a bunny was the best experience of my life. It was a great sorority of sisters. But the filth and language they're attacking me with, I'm frightened of these vicious women. Maston 71 is one of the nearly 30 women who appears in Secrets of Playboy, a 10-episode docuseries which takes aim at the legacy of Hefner, the company's late founder. Since premiering in January, the series has featured Hefner's former lovers, colleagues, and magazine centerfolds making damning allegations about Playboy and its creator. One former playmate, Susie Krabacher, claims that Hefner raped her. Sandra Theodore, his girlfriend in the late 1970s, said she witnessed Hefner, and I'm not going to repeat this claim because it's too disgusting. She also claims he turned her into a drug mule who was forced to retrieve his cocaine. Numerous women say Hefner filmed all the sex he had in his bedroom at the Playboy mansion, often without consent, and kept the tapes. Hefner is no longer alive to defend himself against such claims, but in his absence, a legion of Playboy alumni, I love that phrase, Playboy alumni, have come out against the A&E series at the behest of Hefner's 30-year-old son, Cooper. Hundreds signed an open letter denouncing the unfounded allegations and praising Hefner's upstanding character, exceptional kindness, and dedication to free thought. Playboy, meanwhile, which the Hefner estate unloaded its remaining shares of in 2018, released a statement voicing support for the women in the A&E series and noting that today's Playboy is not Hugh Hefner's Playboy. Cooper Hefner tweeted, "Some may not approve of the life my dad chose, but my father was not a liar. However unconventional, he was sincere in his approach and lived honestly. He was generous in nature and cared deeply for people. These salacious stories are a case study of regret becoming revenge." Solid citizen, that Hugh Hefner. There were two Playboy mansions. The first one is in Chicago, where Hefner founded Playboy, but he later moved out to Los Angeles. It is common knowledge, and not disputed by everyone, that Hugh Hefner went for several years without ever leaving the Playboy mansion or ever wearing anything except pajamas. Does this sound like a normal person to you? Yes, he films this series with three women? And he's wearing this absurd captain's hat, in a navy blue blazer. Joel McHale used to say, "I'm a sea captain." They show clips from that show. Just these horrible stories about dogs running loose, depositing their merds all over the place, and having to be stuffed to the gills with Viagra in order to be able to do anything. But the LA Times continues, the controversy has deepened into a major schism in the Playboy community. On one side are those who forge such close bonds while living or partying in the mansion that they still gather for an annual reunion at a park in Holmby Hills on the anniversary of Hefner's passing. On the other are women like one-time Playboy Club bunny mother Maston, who've drawn closer through the shared trauma of what they claim to have witnessed while in Hefner's orbit. The battle within the world of Playboy has also epitomized the emerging fault lines of a culture in which public allegations of sexual misconduct are ostensibly given more credence, but individuals remain reluctant to speak out against friends and colleagues. And it's all focused on Hefner, who died in September 2017, just more than a week before New York Times reporting on the accusations against Harvey Weinstein set the Me Too movement in motion. Alexandra Dean, the director of Secrets of Playboy, began work on the series in October 2020. She was coming off the successful release of This Is Paris, a YouTube documentary in which Paris Hilton's claimed she was abused as a teenager at disciplinary boarding schools. Yes. So what is extraordinary to me about this, all these claims, everybody knew what went on upstairs. It's just, you get a flavor of this, again, from Star 80. I mean, I don't want to go to any place. Oh, it's so glamorous, where creeps like Sammy Davis Jr. or Telly Savalas, are always lurking about. It just sounds absolutely vile. Oh, but there's free pinball machines. I guess that made up for it. So Sandra Theodore, who is now 65 years old, said, when I started speaking out online, my own children said, it's over, it's in the past, get over it, move on. They were confused by my feelings. They asked me, if it was so dangerous, why did you take us to the mansion? Well, because I didn't know. I stopped drinking the Kool-Aid very late. And Scott Baio here's in this story at secondhand. Even before the series launched in January, rumors about the allegations it might raise were circulating in the Playboy community. Renee Sloan Baio, who dated Hefner for 2 years in the early 2000s, is a member of the Playboy Mansion West family on Facebook, a group that she says welcomes about 500 former Playmates, Mansion dishwashers, and people who work in Hef's zoo. The forum was originally meant as a place to share memories of Hefner and keep in touch, but in recent months it's become a rallying ground for those against the A&E show. I was reading posts from people who had been interviewed, and they said the minute the filmmakers couldn't get anything negative out of them, the interview was shut down, says Baio, who is now married to the actor Scott Baio. When I was there, I never saw drugs. I never saw Hef force anyone to drink. He never forced anyone to do anything against their will. However, if you lived there, there were certain rules. It's the man's house. And yes, these are all jealous women, and they're old and ugly now, and etc., etc., etc. But there's really kind of shocking venom that we see in this article, directed against people making these claims. Oh yes, oh you got a yes. Someone. This is just Joel Berliner, one of Hefner's backgammon buddies, has this extraordinary thing to say. Quote, if it wasn't for Hugh, Holly Madison would be a middle-aged woman with her original nose and breasts selling slices of pizza in Ketchikan, Alaska. It's one thing if someone wants to speak their truth, but no one was upstairs that didn't want to be there. They're trying to pick at the culture of the 70s from the woke-ass, frankly, Calvinist 2022 view of sexuality when it's supposed to be open and free for all people, unquote. I think we can successfully say that the so-called sexual revolution was a failure. It seems that young people don't want to do it anymore, even as the culture, even devolving down to children, that everything is sexualized now. It was supposed to be, light and beauty and freedom and good vibes and all that, and it has turned absolutely poisonous. Some people predicted that at the time, but they were written off and sneered at. Let's take a final look at the chat before I wrap it up. Dan says Hugh hid all the cocaine in the grotto. Golly, I hope they use an enormous amount of chlorine in the grotto. Ugh. Dancing Band says, so Hefner was not a normie, can't hold that against anyone per se. Get that eye checked, says Don Willis. The eye patch works with the robe, too, says Donald Wadler. KMG, good stream. Good night, Soul Brother, says Don Willis. Thank you. Star 80 was entertaining, says Joe against 66. I suppose it was entertaining. I found it draining. It is just so horrible. And it's just a remarkable film, because what is the moral of this film? The wages of sin is death. You don't hear that very often in a Hollywood film, do you? He was listening to Sting on the great Playboy Mansion sound system, says Oscar Toe. Dan Allison calls him a smet puddler with pretensions, period. I think that's about right. Oh, yes. I remember there was a show on one in the late 60s and perhaps the early 70s, and it was it was Hugh Hefner. It was like this late night show, but the conceit was that it was filmed in Hefner's swinging pad in Chicago, right? And these people would show up, right? Oh, and here's all these famous people who are just showing up, and I'm talking to them. And I remember the band Steppenwolf was on, and just this all cringe moment where they're about to start, I don't know, Magic Carpet Ride or something, and Hefty says, "No, just wait. I have to record this." And so you see this fabulous system with some very expensive reel-to-reel recorder, and you see Hef pushing the button on it. Then, now Steppenwolf can play. Let's see. Zen Master says Hefner was so deeply entrenched in IRL debauchery, so could not understand any man who wanted to use a laptop and did not compute. Playboy didn't come to being as raunchy as Penthouse, said David Waller. It tried to keep up, but it was always, we're never going to do that, right? Oh, we're never going to show, pubic hair. Well, they did. And then the shots got more and more, shall we say, naturalistic. Okay. Very much like Autofocus, says Chogakin 666. Another movie I greatly like, Paul Schrader, but it is also draining in the extreme. Okay, let's wrap it up. Tomorrow is Theater Thursday, and I'm going to be talking about a film about trade unions in England, and it's from 1960, directed by Guy Green, and it's called The Angry Silence, and it stars Richard Attenborough and Pierre Angeli. On the book club on Friday, I'm going to be talking about Paul Gottfried's Antifa. So that's it. Thank you so much for tuning in. I greatly appreciate it. I'll be back on the air tomorrow at 4 p.m. Pacific, 7 p.m. Eastern. If you would like to make a donation to this live stream, my PayPal account is linked to kevin_grace@hotmail.com. If you're in Canada, donations may be made directly to the live stream via Interac at kevingrace@shaw.ca. And as always, I leave you with this. In these days of social atomization and civilizational collapse, I do dearly wish that you, my dear viewers and listeners, manage to forge a genuine human connection in order to ease the burden. Good night.